All right, so obviously this is Mr. Hubbard. I'm here with my friend Miss Alize Scott, and we're going to talk about her pursuit of a career in the study of history, her getting a master's degree in the study of history, but also really focus on her interests and just like expertise, I guess we could say, or at least close to expertise on the subject of Black history. So, Alize, just how about you give us some of your background? What made you want to go to school and get a degree, get a career in history?
Yeah, so thanks for having me, Justin. So I actually added African American Studies as a minor in my last year of school. So it kind of added on like another year of school, even though my advisor kind of told me not to do that. But I had taken one course like just as a whim, just to fill up some credits that it was called Hip Hop and Social Issues. So we
Mhm.
kind of learned about Black history through hip hop music, which was awesome. My teacher, so I fell in love instantly, and I was like, why did I not know about this program when I first came here?
Yeah.
So I looked into it a little bit more, and I was like, okay, I have to at least take one more class to see if it's worth adding on a whole nother year, because we all know that college is super expensive. So I was like, let me just think this through before I just jump into it. And so the next semester, I ended up taking an intro to African American history. Again, my teacher was super great, and even the way that like the classes are taught was so different from like the traditional classroom. So I initially went to UB for Spanish and found out I was not very good at that. So I changed that after a year, took a year off to kind of figure things out, and then I went back and became a communications major, and then I added sociology onto that and became a joint major. And then, it kind of just snowballed from there, all of the stuff that I kind of piled on with my degree. But after taking that second African American class, I was like, yeah, no doubt in my head, I need to add this somehow. So I ended up adding it as a minor, just so that way I could finish on time. And then I was like, if I want to get more education in this, I'll get a master's degree, which is what I'm doing now. So I'm back at UB for my graduate program. So it's called American Studies, but I have a concentration in African American Studies and then a little bit in Native Indigenous Studies. And the reason why I chose to do this was because I really did not learn about my own history until I got to college, which I feel like is the case for a lot of Black students, and it shouldn't be the case because we're taught all this other history, history that's not even centered just around America, but like European history and stuff. And it's like, why aren't we learning about our own people and our own cultures? So that was really my driving force behind it. And there's so much that I feel like if we all were to learn this stuff, like this history isn't just for Black people, these majors aren't just for Black people, but they're really beneficial to our country as a whole, because it's not as censored, I feel like, as our traditional education. So you're really diving deep into the roots of America, how it came about, and how our systems are still structured. Systematic racism, systemic racism, you really get all of that by taking these courses that have a different perspective and are through a different narrative than the traditional ones that we're used to reading about or hearing about in our education systems.
All right. And
A
I
long
think
answer, but
I think that's another really cool lesson for our students too is, you said you changed your major multiple times. And a lot of our students are really like focused on like, oh, what am I going to go to college for? What's my major? And really, I think on average, like most college students change their major like 2 or 3 times.
yes.
No. So, and really, you said you went into school and you like that's what piqued your interest. So, like, wow, there's all these other courses in history of these stories that I really haven't heard, right?
Right.
So, I guess then, I mean, my question is, you talked about it a little bit. Why is it important for everyone to learn about Black history or Indigenous history? And when most people would think, well, I'm not Black or I'm not Indigenous, I'm not Native. Why would I need to learn that history?
Right. So this is obviously a misconception because so much of American history is rooted in Native Indigenous history and Black history. You know, when you look at how this country came about, we literally stole land from Native Indigenous people. So that also altered their history and their culture. So it's important that we know. I feel like a lot of times we feel like that history isn't important until like post-colonial times, you know, after they've already been colonized, then we can look into it. But it's like, this was here before we were here. So I feel like that's also important to understand, is that there was already a history of America before it was known as America. So
Mhm.
we need to understand that portion and then see how this influence of colonization kind of changed the way that America kind of formed and developed, and how it did that off of the backs of enslaved people. So that's why it's important to know Black history, because this enslavement, although this was many generations prior to myself, it's still something where people have studied this post-traumatic slave syndrome. And we can see when we look at the system of slavery, how much that has influenced our own systems that we have today, as far as, I mean, our capitalist system, our economy. Like, it's so influential, and it's not things that kind of went away. Even when slavery was emancipated, you know, they kind of just evolved into different systems. So we had like the like peonage laws and Jim Crow, and now we have like mass incarceration. Like, all of these systems kind of feed it off of each other, and kind of it's just like this revolving door. So even though we have like these new laws that come into play that say, okay, yes, now Black people have more rights, now they have more rights, now they have more rights, you know, there's always another structure or system in place that is still perpetuating that system of racism that keeps them still in a place of oppression. You know, we're never fully out of an oppressive state, we're never fully free, despite all of these laws and emancipation that have happened in the past. So that's why it's very important to study these histories, because, you know, there's that saying, how history is written by the victor. So obviously they are not going to make themselves look like these terrible people who created mass genocide and enslaved people and make slavery look like the horrible system that it was, because that's not the image that America portrays of itself. You know, America has never been able to look itself fully in the mirror and understand what she is, you know? And so that's why it's important to learn history through these other perspectives of people that kind of got the brunt end when this country was developing itself.
Yeah. So in other words, there's just if you're really someone who's enthusiastic about American history, there's just, you know, so many more perspectives that we really don't talk about, you know, and not only Black and Indigenous, but, you know, what about the perspectives of women? You know, a lot of times when we talk about women in history, we talk about women's suffrage and getting the right to vote, but then you have to think, like, well, what were women doing before they got the right to vote?
Right.
You know, and I think that's a big part of it, where its history is written by the victors, definitely. And you know, I guess the big question is, you know, how can we learn all this other stuff, you know, and how much is there to learn? We think of something like Black History Month. Um, I think it's important because it just gets people more interested in history overall, you know. I don't know of any, I mean, there's a lot of other, you know, history months and things, Asian American History Month, Native American History Month, but Black History Month is just this huge, you know, wave of like, hey, everybody learn history, and it's history of people and stories that we really don't talk about that much, um,
Right.
you know. And today you specifically want to talk about the Black Power movement. So most of the time when we talk about the civil rights movement, we talk about like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and John Lewis. Um, how is this different?
Yeah, so like you said, we normally learn about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, but even when we learn about them, we don't fully learn about them. You know, they're still very whitewashed when we learn about them in our education systems. You know, they cut Martin Luther King off prior to when he becomes more radical, as they say, when he starts to speak out against the war and he starts to speak out against all of these systems that are oppressing poor people. That's the part that is largely left out about him when he does start to, not that he changed his mind about a nonviolent approach, but just the issues and how he started talking about kind of encompassing all of these other issues into one larger fight. And then even the same thing with Rosa Parks, you know, we're told, oh, like she was just so tired, that's why she didn't want to get up. But it's like, no, yeah, she was tired of racism, you know. So it's all these like large things that we're still missing, even when we're talking about these people that we widely do learn about in the education system. So when it comes to the Black Power movement, this is kind of like came on the kind of like the end of the civil rights movement, which we kind of learn about the civil rights movement just because of the image that it is depicted. And, you know, it was this nonviolent movement. It asks for, you know, kind of like kumbaya sessions with everybody, like, oh, just be respectful, just move through life, you know, and everything will come together. Once your oppressor sees that you are like this, you're not responding in a violent way, then they'll take mercy upon you and things will change. But like Stokely Carmichael said, you know, in order for a nonviolent approach to work, your oppressor has to have a conscience. And America does not, is what he said. So that's why they largely, the people who kind of formed this new Black Power movement, they didn't believe in this nonviolent approach as the only means of going about it. So that's why it's important for us to talk about this other side of it, which is largely left out again because it really shows who America is once you dive into everything that happened once things like the Black Panther Party came about, everything that happened with Malcolm X and all of these leaders that were, you know, out there vocalizing Black Power, even how the media covered it. They were often villainized the same way that we see today with the Black Lives Matter movement. You know,
Yeah.
people aren't listening to the messages that they're trying to spread, but instead trying to suppress them because of how powerful their message would be if it were to take off and actually not be killed off so early from all of these other systems that are working against us.
Yeah. So when I hear something like, you know, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and it's very much like we're all in it together. But then I think people hear Black Power and it really like it rubs people the wrong way. It leaves a bad taste in their mouth because it seems like, well, how am I a part of this if I'm not Black? So like what does that phrase and that movement actually mean? Or what did it mean?
Right. So like you said, when people hear Black Power, it's like, oh my gosh, like that's a scary thing for people to hear. And I think it's because of how we hear white power. You know, when we see like the KKK expressing things like white power, and we see how dangerous an organization like that is. Now, when we see other racial groups shouting the same thing, it's like, oh my goodness, are they going to turn into something like this and now be preaching Black supremacy or Asian supremacy or whatever it may be? But that definitely was not the case with the Black Power movement. So they were more focused on just protecting their communities and self-determination and making sure that they had their own way of living. They weren't subordinates. They weren't relying on these other systems. And they even said in numerous speeches, like, all power to the people. So they were saying white power to white people, brown power to brown people, yellow power to yellow people, Black power to Black people, you know. They were just making sure that no matter what your race is, you should be in control of how your race progresses. You should not be kind of pacified by other systems or subordinate to other systems in order for you to get anywhere. Because obviously, if you are oppressed by another system or another race, your group is not going to go anywhere. You need to be in control. And they talked about, you know, getting into political seats in order to do that, making sure that you get into like the court systems, because a lot of times during these trials, because oftentimes they were arrested for petty things or whatever it may be, things that were kind of fictional or made up, but their jury was all white. So obviously in a time like that, they're not going to get a fair trial. So they were advocating for these things for us to be in similar positions or the same positions, so that way we had a say over our own destiny. You know, it wasn't controlled by what white people in power were telling us that we needed to do with our lives. So that's more so what it was. It wasn't like, all right, now Black people are going to take over and now the world's going to be dominated by Black people. Like, that's not at all what they wanted, but it was more so, let us be able to decide how we thrive as a community instead of putting us in these ghettos, like taking us off of, or getting rid of like these helpful systems, not giving us reliable healthcare, not giving us reliable education systems, things like that. Like, let us have control over this so that way we can be in control of growing our people. And then let the same thing happen in white communities, in Asian communities, and indigenous communities, so that they can uplift their people and they're not relying on this whole system, which we know was a white supremacist system.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned a few times this guy Stokely Carmichael. So you want to explain who he was and what role he played in the civil rights movement and then eventually the Black Power movement?
Yeah, so Stokely Carmichael is actually one of the first ones that started shouting Black Power. So he was a part of the Student Nonviolent Organization Council, and he actually took the seat of John Lewis. And once he did that, you know, the focus kind of shifted a little bit, because although he did praise Martin Luther King, he respected Martin Luther King and everything that he was doing. He's like, once you look at these people in political power, what Martin Luther King is doing is not going to be enough. Like, this is not going to work. And like the quote I said earlier, because your oppressor needs to have a conscience, and these people did not, you know, they did not care about what was happening to the Black community. Therefore, you need to find a different way to fight this monster. So he was more so advocating for, and he got a lot of his inspiration, again, from Malcolm X, which is what a lot of the Black Power movement, they got their inspiration from Malcolm X in his speeches about defending yourself by any means necessary. So again, people think that this was a violent movement, but they were never inciting violence. They were never saying, go out there and kill people, you know. It was kind of just, we are no longer going to sit back and take the things that happen to us. So just be prepared that if you come at us in an aggressive way, we are going to respond accordingly.
Okay.
So that's kind of, you know, what they were preaching, not violence, but just defense. And
yeah, self-defense.
yeah. And so, and they even kind of laughed at how ridiculous it was when people would say, well, aren't you preaching violence? And they're like, well, have you not seen America? Like, have you not learned about the history of America? Like, it's absolutely ridiculous for you to say that we're a violent people if you don't understand the history of this country. It literally formed off of murdering and raping other countries and other populations and races of people. So to say that we're the violent ones is absolutely ridiculous.
Right. With Manifest Destiny and imperialism. Yeah, definitely. So Stokely was the one that started that, and really what happened to him, I guess, like what's his kind of story? So he takes over SNCC, right? Once John Lewis leaves, and then what happens in the trajectory of his life?
Yeah, so he became like an honorary member of the Black Panthers. He wasn't kind of for all of their ideologies. However, he did still like work together with them. But a lot of his work, so he was from Trinidad. He grew up in New York City. But a lot of his work, he kind of preached and did speeches overseas at in Europe and stuff, but still he was fighting for almost on a global level, because he started partnering with other organizations, again, at a global scale, because he realized, like, even though the experience of Black people in America is unique, that this experience isn't just something that's like, they're not just being oppressed here in America. Like, this is a global thing, and we're not the only people being oppressed. So he really wanted to make sure that he was practicing what he was preaching. Like, we want to make sure that all power is to all people, so we're going to uplift everybody. So he was partnering with all these other organizations. And later he changed his name to Kwame Ture, just after some of the mentors that he met while he was overseas. And yeah, he just went about preaching, and he was a very smart guy. And I absolutely love listening to the speeches of the people that were a part of this movement, because I feel like we don't get to hear a lot of this nowadays. You know, we don't really have a lot of Black leaders, I would say, as far as the Black Lives Matter movement. It's kind of more of a collective than it is just like a sole focus on a person. But when you sit down and you listen to just how intelligent these people were, how well spoken they were when it comes to these issues and about just America as a whole, I feel like you really understand that nobody understands America better than the people that are oppressed by their systems. And he really did a great job in his speeches letting you know this is the America that we're living in and this is how we're going to try to fix it.
Yeah. So when you talk about these leaders, were there any like women that were leaders in this movement?
Yeah, so actually the Black Panther Party, you know, a lot of times when we see pictures of them, it's like the guys with the guns and the berets and the leather and everything. But 2/3 of the organization were actually women. And a lot of the leaders were actually women. But, you know, just like anything else, there's a lot of sexism. So we don't really hear much about the women that were part of this organization. But, you know, there was Kathleen Cleaver, Angela Davis ended up joining them. And she was actually, I love Angela Davis. I actually got to see her at UB. She was a distinguished speaker one year. But she was actually the third woman to be put on the FBI's most wanted list because she was such a threat. She was one of the, I mean, she's still alive. So she is one of the like most educated women. And she ended up being incarcerated. You know, they tried to get her on accounts of murder, even though she wasn't even present for these things. But she did a large part in representing herself and
Yeah.
ended up getting acquitted. And it was just absolutely amazing, like the things that she did. And even till this day, she fights for getting rid of the prison system because, I mean, that's a whole nother conversation, but the prison system is very oppressive and it is largely the Black population that is in the prison systems. But
Yeah.
yes, most of the organization was run by women. You know, they were behind the scenes as well as on the front lines.
Yeah. And you say that like Angela Davis is still alive. I think when we talk about the civil rights movement and, you know, the Black Power movement, we think like that was way back. That was in history. So when did this actually take place if she's still alive today?
Yeah, so this happened in the 60s. So I believe that the Black Panthers formed in 1966, 67. So fairly recently, you know, my grandmother was like a kid during that time.
Yeah.
So some of these people are still alive if they weren't killed by the police. Some of these people are still incarcerated for the work that they did while they were a part of the Black Panthers or the Black Power movement. So we still have a lot of freedom fighters that are still in jail because of what they were fighting for years ago.
Yeah. Well, and just to wrap it up, so I mean, we have some students that might find this stuff really interesting. So kind of two questions. One, where can they find out more about the Black Power movement, the Black Panther Party? And then if they want to get into a career in history, a career in, you know, Indigenous studies or African American studies, like what careers are out there?
Yeah, so if you want to learn more, obviously read. I'm a huge advocate for reading. Pick up the books, read as much as you can. There's documentaries out there that actually have actual footage from these time periods, which is awesome to see. You can even go on YouTube and search people like Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X, Bobby Seale, all these people that were a part of these movements, and you can watch their speeches, you can see footage of them. And as far as like careers, if you want to get into this field, definitely go to school. Again, you don't have to go to school for this. You can always just read on your own. But if you do want to like be a professor for this or something, they're going to want you to have that degree. So make sure that you really look into the program that you're going into. Obviously, some are going to be better than others. But make sure that you fall in love with the program. There's some that have like more concentrations than other programs. So get a feel for what it is that you're really interested in, because there is so much of Black history that we don't learn. There's so much out there. So really just dive into what it is that you like. And again, when it comes to careers, there's really, I feel like this is beneficial for any career that you want to go into. So a lot of our students at UB, when they have a degree in African American studies or history, they actually do very well getting into law schools, because when they see that they have that background there, that's something that they want. The fact that you're able to know about other people's history and culture and really be aware of how the system is working prior to getting into something like law school or medical school, that's like very important. So even if you take a different path and you don't just specifically focus on African American history or Native Indigenous history, having that under your belt is definitely beneficial, because if you're going into a job where you're going to be serving other people, it's important that you know about those people instead of just
Yeah.
what we learn from the traditional books. So,
Right.
yeah.
All right. Well, thanks. I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
thank you.